Hey, what's going on, gang? Nate on the Stone here. Welcome back to my channel and to this latest edition of the Rolling Stone. Hope that you have all had a great week, that you have managed to hold on to a sliver of sanity in this increasingly insane world. Everything is flying at us. From all sides. Now, it is just non-stop. The snowball continues to gather velocity as it rolls down the mountain after it was placed at the peak of the mountain and nudged off the side after being taken out of Pandora's box. Personally, I would much rather be talking about UFOs and things like that, because that's terrifying and exciting at the same time. Apparently, next month, the Pentagon, or the government in general, is going to be releasing a huge report, supposedly, of everything that it knows about these things. Because it's pretty clear now that these things are real. Don't know if they're aliens, don't know if it's some sort of super advanced terrestrial vehicle that somehow has been developed without any heads of state knowing about them, something that is so far advanced that people say that they couldn't possibly exist. Don't know if they're from the future. Even that's a good old sci-fi trope or anything. Don't know. Really looking forward to that. We will have stuff to say about that, don't worry. But in the meantime, we've got to talk about the regular humdrum sort of political, cultural stuff that we talk about here. Total societal collapse. We are chronicling the total societal collapse of our civilization, which can be a lot of fun. And we have to start off this week with this story. The House of Representatives, that would be, our House of Representatives, the so-called People's House, which now the people, you and I, apparently can't even look at in the wrong way without being arrested by some sort of government entity. But that same House of Representatives, this is from NBC News. The House of Representatives passed a bill to create a January 6th commission amid strong GOP opposition. Of course, they had to add that at the end there. Now, this, of course, is in response to the quote-unquote riot that happened on January 6th, which we are told, I believe it was Senator Amy Klobuchar, who at one point, at some time 2 years ago, was actually running for president, and no one at all remembers that, because that's what sort of a candidate she was. She said at Biden's quote-unquote inauguration that the rioters had attempted to, They had attempted to storm or desecrate our temple of democracy, which definitely has French Revolutionary vibes when the French Revolutionaries turned Notre Dame into the Temple of Reason. And as I've said from the beginning, gang, we went for over half a year of almost daily riots across cities in the United States. Violent insurrections in Portland, Seattle, Chicago, Minneapolis, Philadelphia, New York, just to name some of the cities. In fact, we had full-blown secession. If you remember, Antifa set up CHAP, and then it was Chaz, the autonomous zone inside of Portland, I believe, where they basically took over a couple of city blocks, where several people were actually killed because they wouldn't allow police, they wouldn't allow ambulances, they wouldn't allow fire trucks in there, and people were actually shooting each other. That actually happened. They had signs up there saying, "You are now leaving the United States. If you crossed over those barriers and entered into Chazistan, as the great Mark Stein dubbed it, you were leaving the United States." Full-blown secession. And yet the people who practically have a heart attack every time they see a Confederate statue that is still standing, because they were nothing but secessionists and traitors, had absolutely no problem with that. The mayor of Portland, called it, it was just a summer of love. People would say, well, they're just protesting violence and injustice, blah, 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 blah. But We can have half a year of all that, completely ignored. But when people actually, quote unquote, riot at the Capitol building because they don't believe that everything was on the up and up in the 2020 election, that is cause for the hammer being slammed down on them. And it shows the complete two-tier system that we have now. This is from the NBC story. The House on Wednesday voted 252 to 175 to create an independent commission to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. But the bill faces a different landscape in the Senate, where it needs at least 10 Republicans, and Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell opposes it. The investigative commission legislation is the product of a compromise announced last week by the top Democrat on the House Homeland Security Commission, Representative Benny Thompson of Mississippi, and the top Republican, Representative John Katko of New York. Under the bill, the commission would include 5 members, including a chair appointed by Democratic leaders in Congress, and another 5, including a vice chair appointed by Republican leaders. Republicans have sought to derail the commission, including insisting the panel have a scope broader than the January 6th attacks, and following the lead of Trump, some have bluntly attempted to revise the narrative of what happened during the deadly riots. You've got to love that, the deadly riots. For the record, gang, and let me just kind of sit down here and give you my thoughts on January 6th. I don't know if I've actually done that since the beginning of the year, since it actually happened. I can't remember. Deadly riots. Now, that is a new sort of lie from the mainstream media, because only one person died on January 6th, and that was Ashley Babbitt, a former Air Force member. She was a vet, and guess what? She was actually one of the quote-unquote rioters. She was the only person who died on January 6th. She was shot dead by a Capitol Police officer whose name is still unknown today. We still don't know. In fact, they had this, there was a few weeks ago, it might have even been last month, there was a brief story saying, nope, Ashley Babbitt's family, they're not going to get to know who actually killed Ashley. They're not going to get to know anything about it because we can't prove that this officer actually violated her civil rights. The woman is dead. Anyone else, and this would have been front page news, the officer's name would have been known. He would have been, goose marched out of the Capitol. They would have forced his resignation, to clear their own name, because, oh my gosh, we don't want to be associated with anyone like that. So, none of that has happened. Ashley Babbitt was the only person who actually died on January 6th. The officer that everyone actually said was killed by the quote-unquote rioters, Brian Sicknick, they actually had his body lie in state at the Capitol because they made him some great martyr who gave his life defending the Capitol from these, redneck MAGA hat wearing hooligans. Guess what? The medical report finally came in. The guy died of natural causes, died of a stroke. He had a stroke and died from that. Later than when the initial reports actually said he died. They said, if you remember, that Brian Sicknick was killed because someone in the mob, quote unquote, beamed him on the head with a fire extinguisher. And then, lo and behold, about the end of March, so almost 3 months after January 6th, the Washington Post ran just a little story where they said, oops, that actually didn't happen. Brian Sicknick wasn't killed by someone wielding a fire extinguisher. No. He just died of natural causes. And then the medical examiner's report corroborated that. Said no. So already, this story, this NBC story about this commission, is trying to keep that narrative alive, that it was a deadly assault, when the only person who died again was one of the quote-unquote rioters. And then this actually leads to, of course, the perennial question, was there actually a riot? Was there actually a riot? Was Trump responsible? Because you even hear people on the right, the David Frenches, the Brad Palombos, the usual suspects who are still trying to scratch a living out of National Review. You keep hearing them say this, that somehow this was a deadly riot, that this was Trump's fault. Well, guess what? It wasn't either. It wasn't Trump's fault, and it wasn't a violent insurrection that was trying to overthrow American democracy. That didn't happen at all. I have a story here from the Claremont Review of Books. That was published in the winter of 2020-2021 by Charles Kessler. The title, appropriately, is After January 6th. All right. And he's actually talking about, was Trump actually guilty of inciting an insurrection, of inciting a riot? This is actually what Charles Kessler says. Going to be quoting a large block here, gang, so stay with me. If Trump's speech has a political target, the speech that Trump gave when he told people to march on the Capitol, okay, that's what he's talking about. If Trump's speech has a political target, it's the weak Republicans who acquiesce in election fraud and will not fight in the trenches alongside him, the Liz Cheneys of the world, as he calls them. We've got to get rid of them, he says. He specifies how that should be done. We have to primary the hell out of the ones that don't fight. You primary them. Later, he adds, in a year from now, you're going to start working on Congress, and we've got to get rid of the weak Congress people, the ones that aren't any good. A year from now means, as the 2022 election cycle gears up, his incitement, so to speak, is to oppose the weak Republicans by challenging them in the normal process of American primary elections. In the meantime, he calls on the audience to walk down to the Capitol in order to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women, and we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them, because you'll never take back your country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong. He adds, I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. It is a sedition to peacefully and patriotically protest, to cheer on brave legislators and boo, or in some cases buck up with pride and boldness, the weak ones. And what if, as Trump hints, it is likely the protesters are ignored and Biden receives a majority of the electoral votes and becomes president? What then? We're going to see whether or not we have great and courageous leaders, or whether or not we have leaders that should be ashamed of themselves throughout history, throughout eternity. The penalty, he points to, is eventually public and private obloquy. If they do the wrong thing, we should never, ever forget that they did. Never forget. We should never, ever forget. Despite his constant characteristic exaggerated appeals to strength versus weakness, Trump's ultimate appeal is not so much to might, but to a form of right, based not merely in history, but in eternity. To know you have acted shamefully is the worst penalty, he advises, or ought to be, which is where public opinion comes to bear, as an external sanction against the otherwise shameless. Unquote. So there you have it. Taken in the context of the whole speech. Trump's calls to resist, to patriotically protest, as he said, wasn't a call for riots or insurrection. So again, there's nothing to investigate here. But okay, you might be saying, so Trump didn't tell them to raise down the Capitol building. People were still violent, weren't they? Well, that's an interesting question, because did you know, actually, gang, that only a small percentage of the official video footage from January 6th has been released to the public even today? And you wonder why that is? Well, it might be because if all of the video was actually released and we were actually able to see it, it would glitch the narrative so badly that they wouldn't have anything left. Here's a story from a great website, AmericanGreatness.com. Headline, video shows U.S. Capitol Police gave protesters okay to enter. A newly obtained video shows United States Capitol Police officers speaking with several January 6th protesters, including Jacob Chansley, the so-called Q shaman, inside the Capitol that afternoon. One officer, identified in the video and confirmed by charging documents as Officer Keith Robichaud, appears to tell Chansley's group they won't stop them from entering the building. "We're not against. You need to show us. No attacking, no assault. Remain calm," Robichaud warns. Chansley and another protester instruct the crowd to act peacefully. "This has to be peaceful," Chansley yelled. "We have the right to peacefully assemble." And they actually give the video clip in question here in the story. I will be linking that down in the description box below so you can read it and see it for yourself. So, we have a case where if you take Trump's entire speech on January 6th, or in the early morning of January 6th, in full context, he's not calling for a riot, he's not calling for an insurrection, he's not calling for the quote-unquote overthrowing of American democracy, and now we have video footage that shows that the so-called rioters were escorted into the Capitol building by the Capitol Police themselves, and that the so-called violent rioters, the deadly rioters, were actually telling everyone to be peaceful. So there is no there. There's absolutely no reason to have a commission, right? Wrong. I mean, that would be right if we actually lived in a halfway sane and, more importantly, just society. But since we live now in a fundamentally unjust society, that's not the case. The reason why, gang, that this commission has been created with the help of some so-called conservatives with Republicans is for one reason and one reason only. And that is to turn the power of the state against anyone and everyone who would dare question the official narrative, who dares to question the new normal, the new regime. Because what is going to be the result of this commission? Well, it's going to be the official validation of what Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden and AOC and what every other ideological bigwig and parroting leftist has been saying since January 6th, that the number one threat that we face today is white nationalist terrorism, which they are also now conflating with Christianity. That's a neat little converging of narrative. White Christian nationalism is the number one threat that we face because it is, as a matter of fact, terrorism, quote unquote. And who is, in fact, a white Christian nationalist? Anyone who opposes the narrative. Anyone who dares to say, no, I protest. No, I do not believe this is true. No, this is not right. No, that did not happen. Anyone who does that will immediately be labeled a white Christian nationalist and therefore a terrorist, and therefore the entire apparatus of the state, especially all the parts that were created after 9/11 to deal with supposedly Islamic terrorism. I mean, it was created supposedly to fight Islamic terrorism, and it's done a real bang-up job with that, will then be turned on to those people. And it's already started to happen. Richard Barnard, he's the guy who was part of the January 6th shenanigans. You know what? If the left can just call... if the left can call certain things shenanigans, I am going to start calling January 6th just some shenanigans. Nothing happened, especially since no one died, except, again, Ashley Babbitt, and she was part of the quote-unquote riot. But when this happens, okay, Richard Barnard, he was part of that group, and he was the one, they took a photo of him. He was the one who had his foot on Nancy Pelosi's desk. Do you know that he has been in jail for almost 4 months without bail? The federal judge denied him bail because he said that he was brazen, and full of privilege. And in addition to that, the feds have now offered him a deal. If Richard Barnard pleads guilty, doesn't fight the feds' case against him, trumped up case against him, he will go to jail for 7 years. 7 years! 7 years for basically putting his foot up on Nancy Pelosi's desk. And of course, if he fights them, then they'll throw the book at him. Then he will never, I think he's 65 years old, he will probably, more than likely, die in prison after they throw the book at him, which is, of course, what they want to do. Now, this, no bail, was part of just some shenanigans on January 6th where the Capitol Police were again giving them the green light, saying, okay, you can go on in. Everyone was saying, we've got to be peaceful. All he did was take a selfie of himself with his foot on Nancy Pelosi's desk, which, again, the taxpayers paid for, so it's our desk. She just happens to use it in her job of supposedly representing the people. No bail. Meanwhile, the people who burned down Seattle, the people who burned down Portland, the people who burned down Minneapolis, they were getting bailed out before they had even spent half a day in jail. They were getting bailed out by staffers on Biden's campaign. They were getting bailed out by Hollywood elitists like Seth Rogen, God rot his fat stomach. So, there is no justice. Of course, they get bail. Richard Barnard does not. And there you have it. There you have it. Because really, when you get right down to it, gang, Richard Barnard wasn't arrested for rioting at the Capitol. He wasn't arrested for rioting at the Capitol. I'm just going to come out and say it. He was arrested for being a white man. That's it. Because I have a companion story here. You might have heard about it. Have you heard of a man named Brandon Elliott? Brandon Elliott is a black man, just to make that perfectly clear. He was arrested for viciously attacking a 65-year-old Asian woman in New York City. Okay? And this Brandon Elliott, was already on lifetime parole because you know what he did in 2002? He killed his own mother. Brandon Elliott in 2002 killed his own mom. He doesn't go to jail. He just has lifetime parole by some soft-hearted judge. He gets bail. Someone like Brandon Elliott gets bail. Someone like Richard Barnard does not. And that's because, I'll say it again, he's a white conservative male. He's a white, straight, probably cisgendered male who happened to vote for Donald Trump and who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, as per the elites. That's why we are seeing now the criminalization of identity. Really, this is one of the fascinating things that you see in an age now, the age of identity, where you can create whatever identity you want. Even if you aren't a woman, you can be a woman. Even if you're not black, you can be black, Even if you're not a dragon, you can be a dragon. Even if you're not an alien, you can be an alien. And all of that is good. In fact, if you do not acquiesce to that, if you don't not just tolerate, but you don't actually applaud, if you do not actually actively cheer, then you are the bigot, you are the criminal, you are the villain. Within that same border, within those same parameters, certain identities are now automatically criminalized. And this is what's going to happen with this January 6th commission. Because again, there's nothing to investigate. If you wanted to investigate why the cops did such a poor job of actually, keeping people out of the Capitol building when you decree they couldn't go into the Capitol building, investigate them. But no, they're investigating the quote-unquote riot itself. When it wasn't deadly, except for Ashley Babbitt, they were allowed into the Capitol building by the police, and they were told by their own leaders, self-appointed leaders, to be peaceful. That's what's happening, gang. The criminalization of certain people based on their sex, their orientation, and their ethnicity. Nancy Pelosi, predicted it. She said that these people had chosen their whiteness over democracy. Well, now we see clearly that democracy is just a cover for whatever the left wants. That is story number one.